what I said about cardiovascular system. This is very easy questionnaire to fill up. You can ask the patient whether you have chest pain, tightness, pressure, had you had any heart attack. If it is so, you just make a tick. If it is not there, you put an into. Whether there is irregular heartbeat, whether the pacemaker is there, any problem with circulation, any previous blood clot in the lungs or legs, high blood pressure. Like that, it is very easy to ask all the questions, and then whether the patient has diabetes, thyroid, kidney, gastrointestinal. So by documenting all these things, you are able to get an overall idea about the patient's physical status, as well as this is only one part of the record. The other side will be giving you the opinion and all this. This is another method of say yes, no. If you don't want to put tick or no, you say yes or no. So that is another form of the questionnaire. And finally, if you don't have time and you are going to examine a patient for emergency, this mnemonic will help you to remember the 5 questions we have to ask. This A stands for allergies, whether the patient has got any allergy to any medications or any food substance, or whether he is on any other herbal medications. And so this medications is regular allopathic or herbal, you have to always ask, because some of the herbal medications cause unwanted bleeding or other problems. Then past surgical history or past medical history, whatever comorbidities he has got, and last oral intake, that will about the full stomach problem, and E stands for events leading to surgery. Okay, so if you remember this simple, I always use this for even our elective cases. These 5 questions are more than enough to find out the condition of the patient as you gain experience more and more. So this is what I'd like to share with you. So this next one. So with these points, you can write both a short note question as well as you can expand them and write if it is asked a full mark 10 marks question also. Are you able to have some idea about it now, Vikas?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So and when the full mark question is there, you have to go in detail for about your airway assessment. You can include your spine and positioning a problem assessment, like if a patient has got a deformed spine, like kyphoscoliosis or a bamboo spine, then planning for a regional in that patient may be difficult. So you have to go for the newer methods of using an ultrasound or other methods to achieve a spinal if you are still planning to go for a RA. Okay, and also you have to make sure if you are going to give a plexus block or an individual nerve block, you have to convince the patient that you may be conscious but mildly sedated. You will be hearing all the noises happening in the theater. Don't get worried about that. So that sort of consoling the patient and telling them in advance, because I used to work with a lot of orthopedic surgeons, and one patient only opened my eyes when he said, "Sir, you never told me that there will be such a noise of drilling machine and all those things." I was really scared. So from that time onwards, whenever I plan a regional to my patients, I always tell them, "You will be hearing all the noises of the gadgets, but you won't have any pain. Don't worry about the noise." And I used to give them earplugs so that they don't listen to our gossips or since you may, some surgeons are not aware of the ethics of keeping the theater quiet when the surgery is going on. They used to make jokes and laugh a lot, but the patient will be anxious and tense. So he will go and tell outside, "See, I was scared, and these doctors are happily laughing and joking, and they are taking it so easy." That sometimes may go against you. If something goes wrong, then that will be held against you as a part of negligence. He will go and report to his lawyer. When the surgery was going, all the time the doctors were laughing and joking, and that is why this complication has happened. So that sort of blame also may come on you. So it is better to follow some ethics in the theater and then try to develop a good rapport with the patient, especially when you plan for a regional technique. The pre-anesthetic evaluation clinic will be the ideal spot for you to develop the rapport and confidence of win the confidence of the patient so that he will be comfortable during the regional procedure. Okay. So these are all the points that I would like to add. So by including all these points, you can make a better presentation of your answer and get better marks. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Right. So shall we go to the next question? Vicarious.
Good evening,
liability.
sir.
Good evening, Pratik. Tell me.
Sir, today's my topic will be vicarious liability for negligence.
Hmm.
Beginning with, sir, definition of negligence. Sir, negligence or professional negligence or malpractice is defined as absence of reasonable care, skill, or willful negligence of a medical practitioner in the treatment of patient, which causes bodily injury or death of the patient. So therefore, negligence can be divided into two acts: act of commission and act of omission. Act of commission is doing something which is not supposed to be done, while act of omission is doing something which was supposed to be done but was missed out during the treatment part. Other classification of negligence can be civil negligence, contributory negligence, criminal negligence, corporate negligence, and ethical negligence. The component of medical negligence includes duty owned, that is, in simple words, the doctor must have treated the patient. So if no duty owned when the doctor is not treated the patient, so no negligence can be filed for that doctor. Second component is dereliction, that is breach from the duty. That is the failure of on the part of the doctor to maintain applicable standard of care and skill of the patient. Third component is damage, that is harm to the patient by breaching the duty owned by the doctor. The damage should be a type that would have been foreseen by a reasonable physician. Fourth one is direct causation. The act should be the direct cause of the harm, that is the failure to exercise a duty of care that must lead to a damage that should be linked to the breach of duty. Fifth one is reasonable foreseeability. A competent doctor must anticipate the complication and react accordingly. For example, if lignocaine is given and sudden shock develops, the patient must be ready to treat the anaphylaxis accordingly and promptly. Sir, negligence in anesthesia. Actually, in anesthesia, deaths are very rare, but according to a study, only 1 in 10K population in 10,000 person die totally as a result of anesthesia. Though the mortality rate vary according to the ASA grading, and which can be summarized as, sir, in ASA 1 mortality is 0.05%, while in ASA 2 mortality is 0.45%, in ASA 3 mortality is 4.5%, ASA 4 mortality is 25%, and ASA 5 mortality is 50%. So negligence in anesthesia can be of various types, means there are various examples. I'm citing those examples, like giving anesthesia without the consent of adult patient or without the consent of a child's guardian for a child pediatric surgery. Sir. Second is failure to conduct physical examination or to take patient history prior to taking the patient under anesthesia. Sir. Third is explosion inside the OR due to negligent part of seeing the explosive items keeping open. Sir. Fourth is contamination of the anesthetic agent, and we are unaware of that. Fifth is breakage of the hypodermic needle inside the patient's body and not taking note of it. Sixth is substitution of the toxic chemical for an anesthetic agent. When anesthetic agent gets finished, then substituting with any other agent. Sir. Seventh is failure to produce total anesthesia and patient is under awareness. They can also sue us. Sixth is eighth is incorrect or excessive use of anesthesia, making patient totally go into in a comatose state. Ninth is brain damage due to hypoxia. Patient's brain damage due to neurological deficits due to hypoxia. 10th is asphyxiation due to oxygen exhaustion. 11th is neurological damage from spinal or epidural injections. 12th is peripheral nerve damage due to splinting during injection of the drug. 13th is leaving the broken spinal needle inside the spinal canal and not noticing it. 14th is epidural catheter tip is left inside the epidural space while withdrawing the epidural catheter. So one of the gross negligences, incompatible blood transfusion during the surgery. Sir. Now going to the topic of vicarious liability. Vicarious liability is nothing. It is just let the master answer. Means respondent superior is one of the most important doctrine of vicarious liability. It can be defined as an employer is responsible not only for his own negligence but also for the negligence of his employee, and if such act occur in the course of employment uh, or in its scope by the principle of respondent superior, which means let the master answer. Following conditions should be fulfilled in the vicarious liability. There must be employer and employee relationship. The employee conduct must occur within the scope of his employment. The employee should be on his job side. He should not be outside. So mainly three doctrine governs the principle of vicarious liability. One I have told earlier, that is respondent superior. Second one is the borrowed servant doctrine. Third one is the captain of the ship doctrine. Sir. Now, I'll be explaining these doctrines in a short terms. Shortly. Means respondent superior is, it is the most important doctrine for the patient actually. Employer or hospital is liable for the employee's negligence. For example, ward boy and a doctor working on a patient and patient gets killed due to ward boy's negligence, then ward boy will go to jail and doctor will be liable for compensation, means for damages, for payment to the patient party. That means doctor and ward boy both will get sued by the patient party. Now, what is borrowed servant doctrine? Borrowed servant doctrine says an employee may serve more than one employer. For example, a nurse employed in a hospital to assist in the OR may be the borrowed servant of an operating surgeon during a surgery in some another hospital. And in this case, the lending employer temporarily surrenders the control over his worker and the borrowing employer will be under the temporary control of the surgeon. Captain of the ship doctrine, that means according to this, chief surgeon is held responsible for its subordinates negligence. Other examples of vicarious liability are when two doctor practices as a partner, each one is liable for practice of one and another and can be held responsible individually. So hospital management will be held responsible for the mistakes of resident physician and interns in the training who are considered employees when performing their normal duties. May it be part-time, may it be a full-time intern. Physician is responsible for the act of the interns and residents carried out under his direct supervision and control if he is under the supervision of any physician. If any swab or sponge or instrument is left inside the patient's body after the surgery, surgeon is held liable and he has to pay for the damages and compensation. A surgeon is not liable for the negligence of anesthetist, and anesthetist is not liable for the negligence of an operating surgeon. Now moving on to defense in the medical negligence. It can be categorized under three types of defense. There is no defense, there is partial defense, and there is complete defense. No defense means under that a doctrine comes that is called as res ipsa loquitur. That means a thing speaks for itself. That means surgery has been performed on the wrong limb, or else engraving the person's name means engraving person's capital initials on the patient's body, like that. While partial defense, under this comes contributory negligence, under which comes two other doctrines like avoidable consequences rule and last clear chance doctrines. Avoidable consequence rule is actually for the patient. For example, a patient with a fractured distal end of radius has been put on a cast, and after 2 days he sees discoloration of his finger, and still he does not visit the doctor. That means patient will be held responsible, not the doctor. While in case of last clear chance doctrine, in same example, patient comes to the doctor other day only, and a doctor does not notice that, and then doctor will be held responsible for his negligent action. Complete defense. In this, if any of these following defenses is applicable, then doctor won't be held negligible. Under this, many doctrines come. First one is novus actus interveniens. That means a new thing has come around in the due course of the surgery, due course of the treatment. For example, successful laparotomy of a patient has been done, and patient after surgery, few months later, patient inside the patient's body fibrous band forms, which causes intestinal obstruction, and due to that, patient sues the doctor. Doctor will not be held negligent, because that it is an anticipated complication which is not the negligent act of a doctor. Second one is product liability. Product liability means if we are giving something to the patient, means if we are prescribing Ciplox 500 tablet to the patient, and we are anticipating that 500 mg of ciprofloxacin is present inside that tablet, but actually 50 mg of Ciplox is only present. So that is not the negligent part of a doctor. Third one is corporate negligence. In this, for example, a hospital has been informed about the infectious agent inside the operation theater, and still hospital is continuing surgeries inside that OT despite not telling this thing to the anesthetist or the surgeon. Then a doctor will not be held responsible. That is a corporate negligence. Error of judgment. Error of judgment means silly mistakes can be done by a human. We all are humans, so silly mistakes can be done, and it can be ignored as a part of being a human. Therapeutic misadventure. Therapeutic misadventure means, for example, if we test penicillin dose before giving penicillin injection, we give a test dose, and patient does not develop any allergy, and after that we give full dose of penicillin, patient goes into anaphylactic shock and dies. So this will be coming under therapeutic misadventure, and doctor will not be held liable for the death of the patient. So sixth one is res indica. Res indica means time limitation for the suing is Government of India means government has provided time limitation for suing to the doctors. For civil cases, 2 years. Civil cases means for compensation and demands for 2 years from the date of surgery or date of treatment is kept. And while for criminal negligence, there is no time limitations. So moving on to precaution against negligence, how can we protect ourselves before committing negligence? So informed written consent from the patient for each procedure should be taken. Establishing very good rapport with the patient and with the patient's attendant should be done. Keeping full and accurate and legible medical record should be there. Employing ordinary skills and care every time during the patient's treatment. Confirming the diagnosis by lab test. Immunization should be done whenever necessary, particularly tetanus. Sensitivity testing should be done before injecting any preparation which can cause allergies. No any female should be examined unless a third party is there. Keeping ourselves informed with the technical advances and use of the standard protocol of the treatment. Seeking consultation whenever in doubt means we should ask for help anytime we are in doubt. Do not criticize or condemn the profession, other profession's ability or another doctor's ability, especially in front of the patient or patient attendants. Do not make a statement admitting your fault. Do not exaggerate or minimize the gravity of patient's condition. Never guarantee a cure. Patient must not be abandoned anytime during the treatment. Transfer the patient if facility is inadequate to handle his or own problem to the higher center or to the other hospital. Do not practice medicine over a voice phone call. Give proper instruction in the pre-op and the post-op period. Do not talk absurd inside the operating room anytime during the surgery. Mark the site and the side of the surgery prior to the surgery. History of any allergy or prior medical history should be taken. In case of any criminal wounding, operation should not be performed unless and until it is absolutely necessary. Anesthesia should be given by a qualified person or in presence of a qualified person. In case of a death from an anesthesia or during surgery, the matter should be reported to the police for handling a public inquiry. No experimental method should be adopted without the consent of the patient, and do not fail to secure the consent of both husband and wife if the surgery is likely to result in sterility. Thank you, sir. That's it. That's all.
Okay. My first opinion when I saw the question that was sent, vicarious liability for negligence, I was wondering whether these two could be clubbed together in one question, because vicarious liability is one aspect and negligence is another aspect. Somehow beautifully you have merged both of them and try to make an answer for a full question level. But what I feel is, more than describing about the legal aspect of negligence, you have given a lot of examples of mistakes that can be done or complications that can be induced, and try to fill up the answer. Okay. So if it is asked as a short note question, you have to omit all those points which you have said, like leaving a broken needle, making multiple attempts. All these things are all part of the complications that can happen in any anesthesia or any treatment part of it. But the more important thing, as you rightly said, is whether it is a willful omission or commission. That is the most important thing that have to deal with. And the main distinction between negligence and ignorance, that has to be highlighted. So we have to deal this question in two parts. One is vicarious liability as a separate heading and negligence as a separate heading. Okay. So first, taking the vicarious liability, first you can define or give the literal meaning of what is vicarious. That is the first and foremost thing I think you should describe. What is the meaning of vicarious? Any idea, Pratik?
Sir,
It is a
literal meaning.
substitute or a surrogate. Okay, someone else mistake, you are being held up or you are being accused. That is what is called vicarious liability. You become a consultant tomorrow and you ask one of your PGs to go and do a epidural block without you being literally present there. You say you are looking after 2 or 3 tables or 2 or 3 OTs, and you ask your senior PG to go and do an epidural block for a particular surgery. You are not present at the site of or the during his procedure being done, and it lands up in a total spinal and patient arrests and some calamity happens. Then even though he has done the mistake, you are responsible for that because you have deputed him to go and do the procedure. So you are taking the full responsibility, believing that your PG has got enough training and he will be able to do the procedure. Okay. On the contrary, he is not able to identify the space, and by mistake he goes into subarachnoid and doesn't realize that mistake, and he gives the full dose and there is a problem. Then the PG is not responsible for that because he is still a student and a trainee, and you are the person who will be responsible. This is the scenario that can happen in our training, I mean, in our hospitals. Whereas the vicarious responsibility was a main thing which was introduced mainly in the US, where because of shortage of qualified anesthetists, they have still today what is called nurse anesthetists, who are trained in anesthesia, both practical methods of IV line securing, induction, intubation with a laryngoscope or a videoscope, giving spinal, all these things, they are also taught all the practical procedures. And whenever a qualified consultant anesthetist is not available, a nurse anesthetist will be asked to start the case and proceed with the case and conduct the case also. But the senior anesthetist or the consultant qualified anesthetist will come and on and off check whether the things are going properly and whether the nurse anesthetist is carrying out the anesthesia at a correct way whether the intubation has been done properly, whether air entry is paka and all this thing, he will come and check in between. On the contrary, taking full faith in the nurse anesthetist, he never goes and visits the theater at all, and some complication happens. And if even if the nurse anesthetist does not report to the consultant or the qualified anesthetist about the complication, and he arrives late in the scenario, still the blame will be only on the consultant or the qualified anesthetist and not on the nurse anesthetist. This is what is called vicarious liability, that you are responsible for the actions of a junior or a subordinate. This is what you have to clearly explain in the vicarious liability. Okay.
Yes, sir.
And this liability, the examples according to the situation in our hospitals, we don't have the practice of having nurse anesthetists, but nowadays we are getting lot of OTA anesthesia technicians. We are being trained and we are getting them for help to load the drugs, to keep the circuits ready, to check the machine, and then keep everything ready for that, so that we can. Sometimes, as days, the number of experiences, years goes, what happens? People become little slack. They know, oh, this boy or this girl coming as an anesthesia technician is very good. She has got a very sound knowledge and she is able to manage and pick up. So what you do is you give them the responsibility of looking after the patient, and you go and look after another work, or go to the next theater and leave them in charge for quite a number of hours. And during that time, unfortunately, if some complication happens, still you are only responsible. Okay. So there are three category of subordinates in our practice. In our situations, we have one is the postgraduate, second is the anesthesia technicians, whom we sometimes rely upon. On the contrary, in the Western world, it is the nurse anesthetists who are all trained and qualified and certified people, but still, in spite of that, because they don't have the qualification of a certifying board like AB, or they are not considered as a consultant or a qualified senior anesthetist, still they cannot be treated as a qualified anesthetist, and whatever mistakes happen when they are anesthetizing the patient, it is the responsibility of the senior supervising consultant. That is what is called the doctrine of respondent superior. Okay. So this is one category of vicarious responsibility with respect to individual senior anesthesiologists. The second category is what you said as hospital liability. Whenever a corporate hospital or any hospital employs some doctors or nurses or what boys or whomever it is, ultimately the director and the CEO or the superior in charge of the hospital will also be responsible for the mistakes done by either the consultant doctor or the nurse or whatever category of employees that have been they have employed. For all their mistakes or negligence, the hospital controlling authorities are also responsible. That is the second category of vicarious responsibility. Okay, so this vicarious liability or responsibility, you have to divide it into two categories. One is the hospital's liability, the other is the individual
Respondent.
senior consultant's liability. Okay, that is one half of the vicarious liability. Now, coming to the negligence, negligence is a common word used in medical practice. It is not only the anesthesia which is included in that negligence. It can happen in cardiology, it can happen in pediatrics, it can happen in neurology. In fact, if you remember, one famous actor, Sri Devi's mother, was operated in the US on the wrong side for the brain tumor. She had a brain tumor on the left side of the brain, and in New York, famous hospital, right side skull was opened and they found no tumor, and they then realized that they have opened the wrong side. So such mistakes have happened in even in advanced countries. Okay, that is called as a criminal negligence. If you operate on the wrong side without taking the proper examination, that is called a criminal negligence. So negligence has to be proved by the patient. That is another point you have to insist on your So if any patient is going to accuse a doctor that he has been negligent in treating me, the onus of proving the negligence lies on the patient. Unless, and what is negligence? You have clearly, nicely explained. And so acts of omission or commission, doing something which ought to have been done, not doing something which ought to have been done is also negligence. Doing something which should not have been done is also negligence. So omission means not doing something which should have been done is omission. Commission is some doing something which is not required is commission. So you commit yourself into something which is not required is commission, and which you do something which should have been omitted is also is called negligence. So that word of omission and commission should be included in negligence. And the second thing is you should have a proper competence before you accuse a doctor that he has been negligent. That is called Bolam test, BOLAMTEST. Bolam test is one which says that every doctor should have some amount of competence, reasonable competence to manage a situation. If he doesn't have that, that means he is not fit for practice. That is why nowadays, once you have been, you have qualified a long number of years back, they insist that you either, especially the US, you have to apply, even to write a upgrading your practice. If you want to continue your practice, you have to take up an exam every 4 years to update you, see whether you have updated your knowledge. And once you pass that test only, you will be allowed to continue to practice. The same thing is now coming into our system also, where they say so many number of CME credit hours or credit points are required for you to continue in practice. Okay, so that you don't just sit idle with your knowledge you learned about 30 years ago and continue to practice with that. So you have to update yourself. That is also important. That is part is called the Bolam test. A reasonable level of updation and knowledge is important for the doctor to have that. Okay. So with all these things, the negligence can be of three types: criminal negligence, corporate negligence, and the civil negligence. These are the three simple categories you can remember. And criminal negligence comes into when the patient is actually very seriously damaged, and corporate is both the parties are involved. As you rightly said, one example of the patient having a fracture reduction and have coming with insufficient circulation with the tip of the hand getting darker. The patient not reporting accounts to his negligence, and doctor not taking care of it accounts to his negligence. Similarly, a liver failure patient, you tell the patient not to touch alcohol because your liver is damaged. He doesn't obey your instructions, and he goes and have a couple of drinks and comes back with a serious condition. It is patient's negligence. On the contrary, after he has taken the drinks and you have not scolded him and you try to accept him, that is your negligence. Okay, so if both parties can be involved in that, and that is called the corporate negligence. And civil negligence is mainly, as you rightly said, is mainly for compensation and monetary benefits. So they sue the doctor and ask for a huge amount of compensation, and that can drag on and go in the court. But now they have set a limit, saying that it should not be dragged like any other civil cases. It should be finished within 12 months or 24 months. Some time limit is there, and within that time it should be settled. So these are the three simple things you can remember. And of course, this being a legal question and not much of books give a lot of details, I really appreciate you for getting so much details, but all the complications you have mentioned will not, they are all just examples, but they are not coming straight into this answer of negligence. Okay. So I'll just show you some few slides with which you can get some idea about how to write this answer. I close it. sorry, I'm not able to open that. I have to. Yeah. Is it visible now?
Visible, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, right. So, so this vicarious liability obligation for reasonable oversight of those working for the physician. That is the obligation for reasonable oversight of those working for the physician. Loss of chance of recovery or survival. This should have happened to the patient. The patient must show that recovery was likely except for the action of the physician. But for this mistake, there was every chance that the patient could have recovered. So this mistake has happened, so patient is now permanently suffering. Now, what are the methods of avoiding vicarious liability? If the anesthesiologist supervising anyone who is incompetent, supervision must be very close, such as double checking preoperative findings, being present in the operating room during the entire case, and do not agree to supervise more simultaneous cases than you can safely handle. And issues of inadequate supervision and patient abandonment are hard to defend. So these are all the things which will lead you into very big trouble if something goes wrong when you leave a junior and then go away and you are not present in easily approachable or easily reachable area, that you are fully liable, and that is what is called the vicarious liability. And as I said earlier, vicarious is substitute or surrogate or secondary liability for not directly getting involved. Whereas negligence is one type of tort. Tort is doing a harm or wrongful act, and malpractice is one type of negligence. Okay, and another, it's a simple general rule. All of us have to remember it. If it is not documented or if it is not written in the court of law, it will be presumed only as it is not been done. You might have given, as you said, after a local anesthetic or an antibiotic, if a patient develops an acute anaphylaxis, you would have immediately given adrenaline and try to resuscitate the patient. But finally, if you don't write in the case records that you immediately administered adrenaline in this particular dose and repeated it till the time the patient was revived, then it will be deemed as that you have not tried to rescue the patient at all. So that will happen in this problem. Now, Bolam test is a doctor is not negligent if he is acting in accordance with practice accepted as a proper by responsible body of medical men. That means he must have an adequate qualification and it should have been certified. For example, by a he might recognized by an university, or he should be having a particular degree. If that has been established, that his act will not be considered as a negligent. This is to differentiate between a quack and a qualified doctor. Okay, so if a doctor is properly qualified and if it is happens by error, it is not called as a negligence. The test is applied in diagnosis to advise and treat the patient, and fatalities associated with anesthesia, surgery, and diagnosis can be categorized as those directly caused by the disease or injury for which anesthesia was necessary, death caused by disease or comorbidities for which anesthesia was given, surgical or diagnostic procedure mishaps, and anesthesia mishaps which can happen as a overdosage, technical failure, equipment failure, and negligence. These are the four categories. So instead of writing each and every individual mistakes that we make, you can categorize the entire answer into these four categories. And the element of negligence, duty of care. Every anesthetist has a duty once he accepts the work. Breach of duty may be due to acts of omission or acts of commission. This wording should be written in your answer. And he has got general duties and specific duties. Doctor is punishable under section 304A of Indian Penal Code. This is the section you have to remember. So the Negligence Act will be penalized under this act. Physician failed to disclose inherent or potential dangers involved to the patient. He should have told the patient what are all the risks and what are all the dangers that are likely to happen. That is why if you see the consent form in USA, when I went there, the US consent form itself is about 3 pages. So they mention each and every, from the simplest to the most drastic complications that can happen. Everything is mentioned, and patient is asked to read that if he is able to read, or somebody has to read to him if he can't read that, and explain, and then get his signature, which is called the informed consent. So if you have not obtained that, that itself will amount to negligence. So you are liable to be penalized because of that. And unreally revealed risks materialize caused by damage. A reasonable patient would have deferred operation with the risk involved. So this is an opportunity for the patient to decide whether he wants to undergo the surgery or not. And medical negligence is divided into criminal negligence, contributory, and civil negligence. So criminal, these are all the things when there is extensive damage to the patient, removal of healthy eye or healthy breast, or wrong amputation of the limb, operation on wrong individual, not taking adequate safety measures, leaving instruments inside abdomen, negligence which is so obvious, as you rightly said, res ipsa loquitur, and failure to attend in time, and inadequate communication. This is the most important reason for majority of the litigations. We don't communicate with the patient. That is why one of the questions in DNP examination is revealing a critical incident, communication skills of the anesthesiologist, because we are always called the behind the screen persons. So we don't have the opportunity to talk the patient like your surgeon or physician who sees the patient right from the beginning of his entering the hospital. That opportunity does not happen to us. So we should develop the best habit of communicating with the patient and introducing ourselves, and then talking to them in detail about everything and get their confidence and rapport, then these problems can be mostly averted. Then the contributory negligence occurs when both the parties are involved, as we have given example. And civil negligence, this has to be proved: omission or commission, wrong medicine, wrong dose, incomplete record, compromise patient safety, hospital infection, deviating from hospital rules. Negligence has to be proved. So all these things are civil negligence, which are going to take a longer time. Okay, so medical profession has its own ethical parameters and code of conduct. However, negligence by doctors has to be determined by judges who are not trained in medical science. That is the most unfortunate thing. That is why we have been requesting to take away our thing from the consumer forum, as well as from being arrested and penalized in the court of law. So they rely only on the expert's opinion and decide the basis of basic principles of reasonableness and prudence by the so judges are not doctors. And there are 3 levels of negligence, what is called gross neglect, moderate, and slight neglect. Okay, then these are all the Latin terms for that: lata culpa, levis culpa, and levissima culpa. And then level of negligence depends on the entire context. It includes the place, the time, the individual, and the level of complications. So all these things go to form the level, whether it is a gross neglect or a mild neglect or a slight. And the difference between medical negligence and medical error is well settled, and the principles are well founded, being clearly laid down in numerous cases of Supreme Court. Okay, so this is what you have to remember with regard to uh, this vague question of vicarious liability and negligence. So don't try to combine both the answers. The vicarious liability is one part of the question, and negligence is another part of the question. If you write in that way, the answer will become much more clearer, and everybody will be able to understand also. And you need not write about elaborately each and every mistakes that are being done. Okay, so you can avoid that and give a general description. That is more than enough. Okay, right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Who is presenting the next one?
Sir, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Myself, Sai, sir. My
Sorry.
topic is merits and demerits of LMA, sir.
Okay. It's more of a very straightforward question. Okay. Yeah, okay, proceed.
LMA was designed by Dr. R.K. Brain as a new concept. One second, sir.
Yeah.
Sir,
Some problem with your audio.
hello, sir. Sorry for inconvenience, sir.
No problem. No problem. Take your time
Sir,
and proceed.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
LMA, sir. LMA was designed by Dr. R.K. Brain as a new concept of airway management, sir. Actually, its goal of its development was to create an intermediate form of airway management of face mask and ET tube, sir. It forms an airtight seal enclosing the larynx and plugging the pharynx and avoid airway obstruction and oropharynx, sir. General advantages are used in can't intubate and can't ventilate scenarios, sir. Allows fast insertion into correct position without moving patient's head or neck. Can be used alone or with a guide to intubation, sir. Miller's classified LMA based on the sealing mechanism into three generations, sir. Priorly said that it is a form as an intermediate form of airway, create an intermediate form of airway management, face mask on the ET tube, sir. So I'll discuss about advantages of LMA over ET tube, sir. It increases the speed of placement by inexperienced person, and it increases the speed of placement by an anesthetist. It will improve hemodynamic stability at intubation and during emergency, sir. Minimal increase in intraocular pressure.
Hello.
Minimal increase in intraocular pressure following insertion, sir. Reduce anesthetic, sir.
Yeah, continue.
Hello, sir.
Yeah. I'm able to
Shall I
hear you.
continue, sir?
Yeah.
Reduce anesthetic requirement. Anesthetic requirement for airway tolerance, sir. It will LMA lowers frequency of coughing during emergency, and LMA improves over oxygen saturation during emergency compared to ET tube, sir. And also it will lower the incidence of sore throat in adults and compared to ET tube, sir. Advantages over face mask is it will also increase speed and ease of placement by inexperienced personnel, sir. And it will also improve oxygen saturation during emergency and compared to face mask, sir. It will it will provide it will have less hand fatigue. It will improve operating condition during minor pediatric and otological surgeries, sir. Disadvantages of LMA over ET tube, sir. It will lower seal pressure and higher frequency of gastric insufflation, sir. And disadvantages of LMA over face mask is it will cause esophageal reflex more likely, sir. And additional advantages of LMA, sir. We can leave provider's hand free, sir. Patient can produce effective cough. allows spontaneous ventilation. Even a malposition can adequately ventilate, sir. There are a few contraindications where you can't use LMA, sir. In full stomach, like conditions like non-fasted in pregnant patients more than 34 weeks, in trauma patients, in acute abdomen, in thoracic injury patients, and opiate pre-med condition, autonomic neuropathy, and any condition known to delay gastric emptying, we can't the contraindication for LMA, sir. And also in a patient having history of gastroesophageal reflux, and a patient with a low pulmonary compliance needing positive pressure ventilation, in that situation also we have contraindication of LMA, sir. There are few complications, sir. Having a risk of aspiration, but less than the there is risk of aspiration. There is a risk of coughing, sir. But compared to less than 80 tube and mask, sir, there is a risk of sore throat, but less frequency than 80 tube, sir. Other uses where we can use bronchoscopy is you can use LMA is in bronchoscopy, in oral surgeries, and in head and neck surgeries, sir.
Completed. Answer over. Dikshit, have you finished?
Over, sir.
See, the question is merits and demerits of LMA, isn't it? That is how the question has been worded. So you have to divide your answer into two subdivisions: merits of LMA usage and demerits or disadvantages of LMA. That is how you have to classify. Okay.
Okay, sir.
And of course, the merits you have started saying that it was designed by Archie Brain as a niche between the use of face mask and endotracheal intubation, and the advantages, it is easy to insert. Even paramedical people can be trained to use it easily. It doesn't require any other instruments like laryngoscope or anything for insertion. And because of that, it has
Okay,
been
sir.
included as a part of the resuscitation equipments in even in CPR, okay, in cases where you have to ventilate the patient. They have included LMA as a rescue equipment for ventilating the patient compared to the previous method of mouth-to-mouth respiration. And the most important thing about this is it is the other methods, merits which have been claimed. Now, world over, LMA is being used very widely. So many millions of insertions have been done because of the simplicity and the ease with which it can be inserted. Okay. But the disadvantages, the demerits of this particular equipment is, of course, the one important merit that you claim is it doesn't cause the sympathetic stimulation that is caused by intubation. That particular point, did you mention that?
Mentioned, sir.
You mentioned it. Isn't it? Tachycardia and hypertension, especially in patients with ischemic or coronary artery disease, the tachycardia and hypertension that can happen because of your laryngoscopy and intubation can be mainly avoided by insertion of the LMA. And another important merit that you can mention is substitution of LMA in patients where you have intubated them for the entire procedure of surgery before you extubate or plan for reversal, in order to avoid rise in intracranial pressure, especially in neurosurgical procedures where you substitute the or replace the LMA with before you lighten the plane of anesthesia and reverse the patient's neuromuscular blockade. Okay, that is what is that? What is the maneuver called? Any idea about that? So you don't want the patient to buck and cough on the tube. So under deeper plane of anesthesia itself, you introduce the LMA start ventilating the patient through that, remove the ET tube, and then you allow the
Intubate.
patient to regain spontaneous ventilation, give reversal, because LMA will be tolerated better without coughing and bucking. Okay, so that is another biggest advantage, especially in neurosurgery. But the major problem that has been hindering its universal use is the fear of aspiration. Especially when the classic LMA was introduced, the fear of aspiration was more, so people were afraid to use that. But subsequent generations have tried to eliminate that risk by including the gastric tube and an opening in the hypopharynx to suck out whatever regurgitated fluid or the other gastric fluids coming out, and made it more safer, so that even in laparoscopic surgeries where you cause a pneumoperitoneum and distance abdomen and increase intra-abdominal pressure, even in such cases it has been used successfully. Another controversial point about LMA usage was the alteration in the position. People were using it only for supine position patients in the earlier days. But later on, with the availability of flexometallic variety and other things, they have proved that even turning the patient to lateral or doing surgeries in the lateral position or sometimes even in the prone position could be managed successfully with minimal risk. So that has also been included in that particular point. Okay. And as you said, the incidence of sore throat is much less compared to the endotracheal intubation, provided the seal is much more, the seal pressure is monitored properly. And that is why the cuffless varieties have come to overtake that, remove that disadvantage of the cuff pressure. You have the eye gel and other things which have a cuffless, yeah, that is, you don't have to inflate the cuff. Automatically, they will swell up and form a good seal and provide a good ventilation. Okay. And definitely it takes away the strain of your hand, and all types of ventilation, spontaneous and controlled, have been used with LMA. So it is not, earlier it was mainly spontaneous ventilation for which it was used. Now it is used both for spontaneous and controlled ventilation. And the fear of gastric distension is also removed by the availability of the gastric port and the ability to remove that. And the other important merit that you can include is it can be used as a conduit for intubation in difficult intubation cases also. So they have a separate variety called intubating LMA. ILMA is there, which can be used for succeeding in an intubation in cases of difficult intubation where intubation is mandatory. Okay, so like that you can classify the heading into merits and demerits, and then try to write all these points and then complete the answer. Okay, right. Mm.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Who is the next one? Who is the next person presenting? Rajesh, are you there? Hello.
Hello, sir. Dr. Arun has
Yeah.
some network problems, sir. He called and told he will do from the next session, sir.
Okay, he's not available. Okay, right.
Yes, sir.
Right, then go to the next topic. No problem.
Hello.
Yes, Sushma
Good
Das.
evening, sir.
Good evening. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. My topic is various regimes in painless labor, sir.
Okay.
So, the pain of childbirth is the most severe pain that a female can endure in her lifetime. So, according to American Society of Anesthesiologists, in the absence of any medical contraindication, maternal request is a sufficient medical indication for pain relief during labor. So the pain is more felt by primiparous women. So 60% of the primiparous women describe labor pain as intolerable, severe, and excruciating pain. Yes. Now coming to the history of labor analgesia. The modern era of childbirth analgesia began in 1847 when J. Y. Simpson administered ether to a woman in childbirth. Queen Victoria was given chloroform by John Snow for her 8th childbirth, and Prince Leopold was born. As told earlier, labor pain is even felt worse than cancer pain. When compared to the various pain syndromes and traumatic pain, the highest grade of pain sensation felt is the labor pain. Labor pain has adverse effect on the on the mother and the fetus if it is not managed properly. So usually what happens is pain will increase the suffering of the mother. There is increased cardiac output, increased blood pressure in the mother. There is a delayed gastric emptying, increased adrenocortical output, increased lactic acid, and increased free fatty acid in the mother. So all these result in maternal metabolic acidosis, which will also eventually affect the fetus. Then what happens is the mother might be hyperventilating and hypoventilating alternatively. Due to the hyperventilation, what happens is there is more oxygen consumption, there is hypocarbia, and the hyperventilation eventually leads to respiratory alkalosis in the mother. This respiratory alkalosis, there will be some compensatory metabolic acidosis following that respiratory alkalosis in the mother. So also due to the pain, there is increased catecholamine release in the mother, and this will lead to impaired uterine contractions. Due to the impaired uterine contractions, there is decreased uteroplacental blood flow, which will further prolong the labor, and this will adversely affect the fetus by affecting the fetal oxygenation. Now coming to the various pain pathways in labor. The labor can be divided into first stage, second stage, and the third stage. The first stage of labor is also known as the cervical stage of labor. It starts from the onset of true labor pain, and it ends with the full dilatation of the cervix. First stage of labor will have two parts, the latent phase and then the active phase of labor. The duration of the first stage of labor is almost 12 hours in case of a primary. It may vary from 8 to 14 hours. In case of a multi-para woman, the duration of labor pain is slightly reduced. It is 6 hours roughly in case of a multi-para. So in first stage of labor, it is mainly the visceral pain. Uterine contraction occurs, and the pain spreads onto the dermatomes of thoracic T10 to lumbar 1 dermatomes. There is this pain is usually due to the distension and the stretching of the lower uterine segment. Since the cervical dilatation is occurring, the bearing down of the part of the fetus leads to the distension of the lower uterine segment. It is mainly described as a dull aching pain, which spreads over the abdomen, groin, and the back. Usually, the A delta and C fibers carry the nociceptive afferent fibers from these areas, and the pain is carried by that. Coming to the second stage of labor, the second stage of labor is defined as the full dilatation of the cervix to the expulsion of the fetus. So this is described mainly as the somatic pain. There is a distension and stretching of the pelvic floor, vagina, and perineum as the baby descends further down. So the pain is mainly carried by the pudendal nerve. The sacral segments S2, S3, and S4 is mainly for this second stage of labor pain. Even genitofemoral nerve, which is lumbar 1 and number 2, in ilioinguinal nerve L1 is also involved in the second stage of labor. So when we are managing the and providing analgesia to the mother, mainly we'll be concerned about the first stage of labor, which might vary from one parturient to the other parturient, and also the second stage of labor, which has to be managed by us. So there will be beneficial effects of relieving the labor pain. First, it relieves the pain, relieves the anxiety, relieves the fatigue of the mother. It prevents any dysfunctional labor. Decreased pain means there will be decreased secretion of catecholamines and corticosteroids, and the uteroplacental blood flow will be maintained. Maternal oxygen consumption will be decreased, and hyperventilation, the cycles, alternative cycles of hyperventilation and hypoventilation will also come down, and this will eliminate the chances of fetal acidosis and hypoxia in the fetus if the mother's pain is properly managed. So now coming to the various methods of pain relief in a parturient in labor. So there will be non-pharmacological methods as well, and pharmacological methods. Non-pharmacological methods can be started earlier, not at the later stages of pregnancy, but we can start it much earlier in pregnancy itself. Non-pharmacological methods will have again two types: specialized and non-specialized. Specialized will include acupuncture, use of hypnosis. TENS is transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, and intradermal injections of sterile water. Non-specialized methods, as I told, can be started earlier in pregnancy, which will mainly include counseling of the mother, making her aware of the process of labor and the different changes in labor. And also it will include hydrotherapy, hot packs, massage and aromatherapy, ball exercises, yoga and breathing techniques, yoga exercises for strengthening the pelvic floor, then education of a birthing partner, and the birthing partner is encouraged to be with the mother to provide constant emotional support. And Lamaze classes, prenatal Lamaze classes are also included in this non-specialized methods of analgesia. Now coming to the main thing, the pharmacological methods. Pharmacological methods includes use of systemic drugs, which is the IV drugs. We can use inhalational agents, and we can use regional anesthesia. So coming to inhalational agents. For inhalational agents, basically we most commonly we use Entonox and Civox. So Entonox is nothing but the combination 50% nitrous oxide and 50% oxygen. It is self-administered by the mother using a mask. Whenever the mother is feeling any labor contraction at the peak of the pain of labor, she can self-administer Entonox as and when required. The benefit is onset of action is very fast. It is like within 30 seconds of self-administration, action will be seen, and the maximum analgesic effect is seen within 1 minute. 45 seconds to 60 seconds it will be seen. There will be rapid diffusion of Entonox and rapid induction and rapid recovery. Advantages is self-titration and easy method of use. So the mother can be well informed before and trained how to use this mode of analgesia. second, which is commonly used, is sevoflurane. Sevoflurane can be used in the inspired concentration of 0.8% along with oxygen. Other methods, which other inhalational agents, is the Entonox and Isonox. Isonox is 50% nitrous oxide, 50% oxygen, and 0.2% isoflurane. Other inhalational agents like desflurane and isoflurane is usually avoided because of the pungent nature. Now coming to the systemic drugs, the IV agents which we can use, non-opioids and opioids. First, coming to opioids, opioid and agonists and opioid antagonists can opioid agonist antagonist can be used. So agonists will the most commonly used nowadays is fentanyl. In earlier days, we used to use pethidine, which used to provide labor analgesia. So coming to fentanyl, fentanyl is a potent short-acting opioid. The onset of action is very fast. It starts within 3 to 5 minutes. Peak analgesic effect can be seen within 5 to 15 minutes. There are advantages. There is no active metabolite in fentanyl. The bolus dose is from 25 to 50 micrograms every hour. And continuous infusion can be given at the dose of 0.1 micrograms to 0.2 micrograms per kg per hour. Advantage of using the fentanyl is there is less nausea, less vomiting, less sedation when compared to morphine. And but the adverse effects is it can cause hypotension, bradycardia, and respiratory depression. Newer opioids which can be used but not readily available in India is remifentanil. A little about pethidine, which was used in earlier days. Pethidine is a synthetic phenyl piperidine derivative. It can be administered intramuscular and it can be administered IV, intravenous. So intramuscular dose is 50 to 100 milligram and intravenous is 25 to 50 milligram. It has an active metabolite, which is norpethidine. The disadvantage of this metabolite is it has convulsant properties. Onset of action of pethidine is within 5 to 10 minutes, and the duration of action of pethidine is 3 to 4 hours. So every 3 to 4 hours, pethidine has to be repeated. The main disadvantage of pethidine is it causes increased nausea, vomiting, and it can cause respiratory depression in the neonate. So in case if there is we suspect respiratory depression in case of after use of pethidine, we can use naloxone at the dose of 0.1 ml per kg for treating fetal respiratory depression, and for reversing maternal respiratory depression, naloxone at the dose of 0.4 mg IV can be administered. And before administering pethidine, we should always keep ready some resuscitation equipment and naloxone nearby before using pethidine. Now, agonist antagonist which is used is tramadol. Tramadol also produces satisfactory analgesia in the first stage of labor, but not so very effective in second stage of labor. There is the advantage with tramadol is there is minimal respiratory depression with tramadol usage, but the most adverse side effect with tramadol is it causes increased nausea and vomiting. The usual dose of tramadol is intravenous 1 mg per kg. Now coming to the non-opioids, non-opioid methods, we can use paracetamol. We can use sub-anesthetic, sub-hypnotic levels of ketamine. So ketamine, a little about ketamine. Ketamine, preservative-free ketamine can be used for providing labor analgesia. The duration is usually like 1.5 hours or so. The bolus dose of ketamine is 10 to 15 milligram IV. The dose will be 100 to 200 micrograms per kg per hour. The disadvantage with ketamine is it will cause increased intra-abdominal pressure, so there will be chances of aspiration, and also hemodynamic changes will be high in the usage of ketamine. There will be increased chances of hypertension and tachycardia. Now, finally, coming to the regional analgesia methods, which we can use for a parturient. It can be central neuraxial blockade, and peripheral nerve blocks can also be produced. Can also be administered. Central neuraxial blockade is mainly for managing the active stage of the first stage of labor, and also the second stage of labor. So various neuraxial techniques which are used are lumbar epidural, continuous epidural analgesia is provided, combined spinal epidural analgesia, then continuous spinal analgesia using a microcatheter, single shot spinal, and caudal epidural, continuous caudal analgesia is provided. So first we will see what are the changes in the neuraxial anatomy in a pregnant patient. So due to the changes in the neuraxial anatomy, our combined spinal epidural technique might fail. So it's useful to know the changes specifically in case of a pregnant female. So there will be lumbar lordosis, widening and rotation of the pelvis. There will be engorged epidural veins, difficult identification of the ligamentum flavum, reduction in the intervertebral gap, and narrowed epidural space will be there. So for the ease of anesthesiologist, we can take the help of USG. Under USG guidance, we can do the central neuraxial techniques. So coming to the indications of lumbar epidural analgesia, as I told earlier, maternal request is the primary indication for labor epidural. So what we say is maternal request, any maternal cardiovascular disease, specifically like preeclampsia or PIH, then if preeclampsia under control, we can take it as an indication for providing labor epidural. Gestational diabetes, any difficult maternal airway, which can include a thyroid mass, it is an indication for going for lumbar epidural. In cases of prolonged labor also, we can take it as an indication for lumbar epidural. Coming to the contraindications of epidural, obstetric contraindications will be malpresentation of the fetus. Malpresentation, transverse lie, breech, oblique lies will go for epidural. We cannot go for epidural. Incoordinate uterine contractions, non-assuring fetal heart, and then these are the contraindications. Absolute medical contraindications is if the patient is a known has a known cardiac disease, NYHA classification 3 and 4, it's an absolute contraindication. In cases of hypovolemia, coagulopathies, if there is epidural site infection, then we will avoid. In case of any anatomical deformities of the back, it's a contraindication. Also, if there is maternal pyrexia, if the total count is higher than 20,000, we will avoid doing any central neuraxial block technique. Now coming to the various epidural methods, we can use the intermittent bolus dose, we can use a continuous infusion, we can use dural puncture epidural, and patient controlled epidural analgesia. So what are the prerequisite checklist for before taking the patient for lumbar epidural? First is checking the lab investigations like the total count, the platelet, PT-INR for selected cases. A proper pre-anesthetic checkup is required for the mother to know any previous existing diseases. Then we will check the vitals. Proper systemic examination of CVS and cardiovascular system and respiratory system should be carried out. A proper examination of the airway has also to be carried out in cases of emergency. We will check for a good peripheral IV access. Now coming to this, we will check for all the routine and emergency equipments inside the OT. And during the providing the labor epidural, a proper monitoring for mother and the fetus both are required. So multi-para monitors for mother and fetal monitoring in CTG is advised. In cases of labor epidural, we will see whether there is a strict aseptic precautions which has to be maintained. Now coming to the low dose epidural regime. So before the low dose epidural regime, the test dose, I would like to discuss the test dose of which we will use. Small volume of high concentration of local anesthetic, usually 3 ml of 0.5% bupivacaine can be administered. High volume of low concentration local anesthetic, like 10 ml of 0.1% bupivacaine can be given as a test dose. The use of lignocaine with adrenaline is controversial. So usually if we are using lignocaine with adrenaline, we can administer 3 ml of it. Now coming to low dose epidural, the dose used is, if we are using bupivacaine or levobupivacaine, it is 0.0625% to 0.125%. Ropivacaine, if used, is 0.1% to 0.2% concentration. So basically, we are using decreasing the total dose of local anesthetic. The added advantage of this is motor blockade won't be there in low dose epidural. Addition of opioid can be there. Usually 0.0625% bupivacaine along with 25 mics of fentanyl, or 2 microgram per ml of fentanyl can be used in case of a low dose epidural. Combined spinal epidural analgesia or walking epidural basically combines the subarachnoid component along with the epidural component. Advantage of combined spinal epidural analgesia or dural puncture analgesia epidural is its rapid onset of pain relief, and is better perineal analgesia, and higher ambulatory potential is there, and lower drug use. The dose here is 25 to 50 micrograms of fentanyl, and bupivacaine 1.25 to 2.5 mg of bupivacaine along with the fentanyl. And this is the loading dose, and this can be followed by the continuous infusion of 0.0625% bupivacaine with 2 microgram per ml of fentanyl. Usually, the infusion dose will be 8 to 10 ml per hour. In case of a patient-controlled epidural analgesia, the same composition can be given at 6 to 8 ml per hour, but with lockout interval. So if when epidural top-up is required by the patient, she can demand for the local anesthetic and fentanyl, and then there will be a lockout interval of 20 minutes. Then other methods, single shot spinally can be given. Single shot, the basic thing in single shot spinal is low dose of bupivacaine, 2.5 mg of heavy bupivacaine, and micrograms of fentanyl can be used. And caudal epidural analgesia can also be provided. The complications related to epidural analgesia is there can be chances of PTPH, and there is chances of fetal bradycardia, neurological injury might be there. If there is focal sepsis or any infection, meningitis can occur, and there is chances of high spinal because of the narrow epidural space in a parturient. Pruritus might happen in case we are using morphine at the epidural space. Newer techniques are computer integrated patient controlled epidural analgesia. Here, it is a computer program which will adjust the initial dose of the local anesthetic which is to be provided, and based on what earlier dose has been provided by, in the earlier hour, the next hour dose of local anesthetic is determined by the computer. Another is programmed intermittent epidural bolus. it also uses the same principle where epidural boluses are given at predetermined time. So according to the computer program itself, it will continue. These were the central neuraxial blockades. Other than this, we have regional techniques like peripheral nerve blocks. Peripheral nerve blocks, we are mainly, we can give pudendal nerve block, which is usually given in case of forceps deliveries and episiotomy. Before episiotomy, will be giving pudendal nerve block. 7 to 10 ml of local anesthetic is injected transvaginally or in transperineal route at the locations of medial and posterior sides of ischial spine. Liver
Completed.
analgesia are not so yet not so popular in India or not routinely used. It's very well maintained in the Western countries.
Which one is very well maintained in Western countries?
Labor analgesia, everybody is aware of labor analgesia in the Western countries.
Right. So thank you, first of all, for sending your write-up earlier. It was 16 pages write-up, correct? And in a theory exam, I have repeatedly been insisting that you should try to write your answers for every question within the maximum of 18 to 20 minutes. Okay. So I think this is a good preparation and presentation for informing the details about labor analgesia to all the students. If it is a topic given to you as a presentation for your either a class presentation, but from examination point of view, I feel you should all practice to write your answers for whatever questions you are given here and time it in such a way that you will be able to complete it within a maximum of 20 minutes so that you don't miss out on other questions in your theory exam. Otherwise, one or two questions you leave out, then the chances of getting your marks are very much reduced. And majority of the unsuccessful candidates have left out one or two questions, and that is the reason why they could not complete the paper. Okay. So you should try to make a synopsis of you can prepare elaborately and then try to edit it in such a way that you can present it within 20 minutes time in your theory paper. So you can first give the subheadings in your opening sentences that what you are going to write about labor analgesia. I went through the question bank of TNB and they sometimes asked describe the physiology of labor pain and methods of relieving that labor pain. That is one wording. The other wording is what are all the recent methods of managing epidural labor pain. And third one is describe the regional techniques employed in patients who to be for relieving the labor pain. Like that, they vary the question in different manner. And so depending upon that, your answer has to be slightly modified. What you can do is first you must define what is the importance of labor pain and why it has to be abolished. And there you mentioned all these points that what happens to the mother in the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, and what is the effect on the fetus, everything has been nicely described. In addition to that, the first remark that you should make there is, it is inhuman to allow a woman to suffer just because she has become pregnant and she is going to deliver a baby. Okay, that is the first and foremost thing. Anybody as anesthesiologist or as medical people, our main oath, Hippocrates oath is, I will not allow my fellows humans to suffer from pain and disease. That is our oath. So that is the first and foremost reason we want to abolish that pain. The second, the other reasons are all more based on the physiological changes that happen, and that is the reason why we want to avoid that. The next thing is you must explain the pain pathway, how it is conducted. The first half of the labor is mainly visceral pain. The second half and third half are mainly somatic pain. All that can be described in a short way, and you have nicely sent a diagram also. That diagram can be easily used to reduce the time required to write so much of lengthy sentences. Okay, and the root value is 10 to L1, and the somatic is S2 to S4. And the nerves that you have mentioned, all that can be mentioned as a bullet point. And the why you should know about the stages of labor, that should be explained, because the mode of pain relief will differ according to the stage of the labor. That point has to be written clearly. And here you can say that the plan of labor analgesia or management of labor pain starts from the antenatal period itself. Instead of mentioning that non-pharmacological, pharmacological, where you mentioned about yoga, hydrotherapy, exercise, small exercise, partner, this thing, that all starts right from the first trimester itself. Many of the physicians now have designated classes for teaching the mother in the antenatal period what they have to expect and how they have to behave, all the breathing therapy, yoga therapy. This has become a big business itself. They charge exclusively for weekly 3 classes, 4 classes like that. And as the term nears, they are asked to come frequently, and then many of them are given the idea that you can have a normal vaginal delivery without pain if you follow all these exercises. So that one sentence you can mention that the labor pain relief starts as early as in the antenatal period, right from the first trimester. But the acute pain after the onset of labor starts with the conventional methods of pharmacological and non-pharmacological, like acupuncture, TENS, the saline injections, all these things are done after the onset of acute pain. Then coming to the first stage of labor is the ideal stage for going for either an inhalational or a parenteral analgesic drugs. And in the inhalational drugs, when you mentioned about Entanox, which is still in use and widely used in the UK, they apart from the advantages that you have said, is the two wordings or the phrases that you should use there is it has a demand valve. More than teaching the patient about inhaling the fumes at the onset of the labor contractions and the action coming on within 30 seconds, there is a demand valve. Only when the patient takes or creates negative pressure, the Entanox gas will be delivered to the patient. Otherwise, it will not get out of the cylinder. The second thing is it can be used in the domiciliary treatment also before shifting the patient to the hospital. And majority of the times, Entanox is handled only by the midwives in UK. So it doesn't require a doctor to be around with the patient, and only midwives are certified to handle this. That point also reduces the stress and load on the obstetricians and the medical personnel to supervise these patients. So that point also you can say. But the disadvantages are if the patient is not properly learning how to use that, they can inhale it too much and become slightly unconscious and lose out on that. But it is considered as a very safe method of analgesia. Of course, the newer trends are the CVOX and the ISOX and all these things. And you can just make a brief mention of that. Coming to the parenteral drugs, what you have described is pethidine is still commonly used, but all these things should be started well in the early stage of the first stage of labor. When the contractions become regular and more intense, that is the time you have to use the parenteral drugs, not very late in the first stage of labor, because then it will definitely affect the fetus and the Apgar score of the baby will not be as good as used when you give it in the earlier stages. And the pain relief also, by giving it very late, you are allowing the mother to suffer for quite a considerable time in the first stage. So it should be ideally timed. That is very, very important. And all the merits and demerits of each and every drug you have mentioned correctly. And any role for dexmedetomidine?
Yes, adjuvant dexmedetomidine and clonidine can be used as adjuvants
Yeah, that is also one of the drugs which are used now. So that is a newer comes under the newer methods of managing the labor pain relief. So ketamine has been given both intravenously, but the intravenous dose has produced more emergence problem, and sometimes it produces anesthetic effects more than analgesic effects. So nowadays they think of giving low dose ketamine. The second route of administration is intrathecal ketamine. People have presented a lot of work on intrathecal ketamine, preservative-free ketamine injected for labor pain relief, which maintains the motor strength as well as provides very good analgesia, so that the maternal contribution to the what is called the so-called push will be maintained, and that is another advantage. So the main reason why labor analgesia has not picked up is by the myth surrounding that technique, that labor analgesia reduces or prolongs the duration of labor without the mother cooperating with her muscular effect. That is the main reason why the labor analgesia has not become popular even now in our country, because of this particular reason. But many papers and many studies have proved that it is not true. And another reason the obstetricians claim is the incidence of assisted or instrumental delivery has increased because of labor analgesia. These 2 points you have to write, and that is the reason why it is not picked up or become very popular. Okay. And then all the you don't have to spend so much time on the various problems of epidural, lumbar epidural technique. You can just briefly mention this is how it is done. Coagulopathy is one important contraindication. And with regard to tramadol, it should be very careful in giving it in a pre-eclamptic patient. If you are using it in a, because it has got epileptogenic tendency, already a pre-eclamptic patient is likely to have eclampsia anytime. So usage of tramadol in a pre-eclamptic patient is not advisable. And the other methods of you mentioned about single shot subarachnoid spinal, where you use half a cc or 2.5 milligrams of heavy bupivacaine. That can result into some amount of motor blockade. Okay, so it cannot be used for ambulatory procedures. So that
Only
is
in the later stages of labor we can give
yes.
short.
That is the patient will anyway, even if with the 2.5 there will be some motor deficiency. Okay, so the patient definitely we cannot walk or as you do in walking or epidural. And the use of intravenous lignocaine and magnesium, all these things have been tried. That is all the recent advances or recent techniques that have been used, especially if the patient is a pre-eclamptic patient. To control seizures, they give magnesium sulfate. That itself has got some analgesic property. So patients who are have pre-eclamptic, if they are given magnesium sulfate, not only as an prophylaxis for preventing a seizure, but also it can be used as a analgesic in those patients. And those patients, you don't have to give separately some other parenteral drugs or other techniques. This itself can take care of the pain. Okay. So these are all the few points that you can add to that. Otherwise, it's a nice, good presentation by you. Thank you, Doctor. Any questions or any clarifications? Rajesh, who is there controlling the show today? Hello? Host, Yaro, host. Who is the host today? Okay, I will.
Sir, this is Dr. Jayasudha. Good evening, sir. It's a pleasure to know you here, sir. I'm Dr. Kamakshi's wife.
Okay.
I'm only hosting the program today partially because
Okay.
he's not able to connect to the net, sir.
Okay, ma, no problem.
Yes, sir. So this
Yeah.
was a very interactive session, and I think
Yeah.
it will be useful for all the PGs who are taking up the exams.
Thank you.
And thank you for this presentation. All the PGs also have done a very nice
Yeah,
job
they
here
have
today,
taken
sir.
a good interest and
Yes, sir.
they are presenting
Yes,
very
sir.
well.
And
Okay,
thank you so much, sir. And I think we'll stop here, sir.
class.
Good
Yeah,
night,
thank
sir.
you. Good night.
Yes,
Good
sir.
night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you very
Yes, sir.
much.
Thank you, sir. Hello. Hello. Yeah, signals కొంచెం problem అన్నలా. And that is what that's why we